Hi there, and welcome back to another episode at Station Road. Now, as you can see, some further progress has now been made with the engine shed and depot area, and of course the incline that rises up to this area. So a quick recap on the previous episode, which was stage 2, and it was a case of raising the existing engine shed area, which is kind of just out of shot here, and of course that was raised up by 18 millimeters, and of course included with that was bringing up the first half of the incline to meet this section, which was built in an earlier phase. So as you can see, I've moved along a little bit further and obviously painted the MDF in a base grey. Now the reason for doing that is because I'm using MDF, 5 or 6 mil MDF, putting down a base acrylic paint any sort doesn't really matter. When it comes to ballasting, what I actually find in the past, I have not bothered to paint the MDF, and of course when the water glue mix seeps through the ballast, it actually soaks into the MDF, can warp the MDF, but what it actually does is it kind of sucks the watery glue mix out of the ballast and just ends up in the MDF baseboard. So by doing this, you're basically ensuring that the MDF is protected from that ballasting process, because of course part of the ballasting process as well is spraying the ballast with some fine mist of water as well, so things can get quite drenched when it comes to that ballasting process, and of course having this painted protects the MDF from damage. So you can probably just make out in this bottom corner here, and what I've done is added in some fascia to the incline area. So this is just 2-3 mil MDF. It's very flexible and it's been anchored into place and glued, and essentially what that does is it creates a base structure or foundation which can then have retaining wall or any other kind of scenic areas added to it afterwards. The other benefit too is it increases the strength of the actual incline structure, so it becomes quite solid. So the spacing obviously between the risers, you could imagine a little bit of flex in between those risers, so by installing this sort of fascia on the edges, it essentially turns it into quite a rigid track bed surface. So as you can see, I've got one last little bit to do, which is around here, and I couldn't do that until I had actually permanently fixed this structure in place. So this is now anchored in place. It is screwed in, so if need be I can unscrew it, take it out, and of course possibly do the point installation and all the wiring underneath, although I don't think that's necessary. The access through here is not bad, so it'll probably just stay here and become permanently fixed. So I've measured out the strip to run through here, and I've pressed in a few wee track pins in here just on the edge. That's just going to help hold it in place while the glue sets. So once this is in place, of course the next step that I will be getting onto is actually relaying the track. Now as you can see, you can probably see some nails or small pins poking up in the track bed. Now I'd previously laid all the track and planned it out, so I could actually work out the exact lengths of flexi track, where the points are going exactly, and of course marking out these slots in here, which is where the point motors will sink down into. So the reason of course for poking these pins back into the baseboard where the holes were, where I'd anchored the track in the first place, was simply to recognize where the holes were, because obviously painting this over, it's going to cover up these tiny little holes, so that's why I popped them back in before I went over this with the grey base paint. Right, so that's now in place, and I'm probably just going to pop a few more pins in here just to anchor it in various places. The pins themselves aren't really going to be the strength in this, of course it is the actual glue that's going to support the structure through here. So we're now at the point of setting some of the point work back into the baseboard, and I've gone ahead and pre-wired all of these points, and there's a link in the top corner for a video some time back where I go into a little bit more detail about how I go about setting up electrofrog points and how the point motors are set up. So as you can see, I mount my point motors directly to the underside of the track, hence why there's a rectangular hole here and the whole unit slots into the baseboard. Now, one of the reasons really for why I use this method is it means I can install the point from the upper side of the layout and just simply drop everything in. I don't need to clamber around underneath and fix screws or mount a unit on the underside of the baseboard. It also means too that, particularly in this situation where I've got a layout that's got 2 layers to it, is the point motor doesn't protrude as far down below the baseboard level, although of course there was the issue that I had over that way, but that was soon remedied. So we've got 4 standard type points, 2 curved and a long straight and a short straight, and then of course we've got this 3-way point, which is essentially 2 points in one, and that gives us 6 points to control. Now, some years back I bought one of these. Now this is a DCC Concepts ADS 8SX DCC DC solenoid decoder. Now it's designed to power solenoid point motors, and I don't think it can operate your tortoise or cobalt point motors. Now the beauty about this unit is it can be DC or DCC. So currently I'm going to install these point motors as DC, which is essentially what the rest of the layout is. I have a control panel which operates all the point motors, and of course it's completely independent of the DCC train operations, and it's just the way I've kind of preferred it up until now. But in saying that, in the future, and I'm thinking possibly some years from now, there is the possibility that I could switch over all my point control to DCC, and that's simply by using these units. So we'll start by slotting all of these points into their respective spaces, and of course we've got our rectangular holes. We've got holes for the frog and also the dropper wires. Now these power wires, or the power bus wires, they actually will lead into this unit, of course, into the respective ports, which will then give a return feed for our frog. And then of course we've got our motor wires as well, and then they get fed into here, and then there's another bunch of ports that can then be connected to a switch which will be hooked into my control panel. So it's just a simple case of feeding these wires down through their respective slots, and that's our power feed and then our frog. So the plan is that I'm going to mount this unit somewhere in this area. Probably there's a spot underneath here, and it's kind of central to where all this point work is going to be. And then of course I'll have these wires feeding into some terminal blocks, and that can all then transfer over to this unit here. Now, because I'm using this just simply in its DC mode rather than DCC, if you're using DCC, you could simply just take a feed from your power bus, which is obviously, you know, your track power. I'm, of course, as I mentioned, doing this independently, so I've just got a wall transformer. I think it's 15 volts 2 amp, so this unit can accept, I think, between 12 and 20 volts, so it's just simply going to plug in as an independent unit. So I've now installed all the points and of course connected up the track work between all of the point clusters, and all the track work is now in place and pinned down. So before I can do any testing of trains, first of all I have to now add in dropper wires, which I'll do shortly. But one of the things that I really wanted to look at and kind of wrap my head around, because I often find the electrical side of railway modelling just a tad confusing. No matter how good the diagrams are, it's not always how it comes out in the end result. So what I've done, as you can see here, is I've set up this DCC Concepts decoder bank, and I've of course labelled each of the banks that need to be controlling each of the point sections. I've got 2 distribution boards here. So what we've got over here is we've got black wires that feed into each of the switch terminals on here, so that's the common terminal on each of these decoder banks. And then over here we've got, starting from this end, will be the power feeds going out to the track power for the point section. So in here we've got a red and a black, and that is powering these 2 rails, and then these 2 rails that goes into here. And then from the other end we've got red and black wires coming out that go into the frog terminals, and then from there the green wire comes out and goes back into the frog here. So it looks rather complicated and confusing, but I thought I really wanted to set one point up. Even though this is temporary, this is not where the decoder bank is actually going to go. That's going to be slot underneath, but I really just wanted to make sure all of this was going to work. So I've hooked up this point here. Now I've just temporarily wired in one of the switches. Now of course this will actually be over that way in the control panel, and this is just a single pole double throw switch with a center off, which of course is spring loaded. So we'll flick the switch on this, and of course the point blades will change on this point. So we clearly know we've got that working. Now the main test that I really wanted to make sure was working was making sure that polarity for the frog was acting as it should and change depending on which way the point is. So I can test that with our meter, and at the moment we've got the point blades heading off for this track here. So the theory is this rail and the frog should be live. So if we just connect up, and there we have it, we've got 15 volts running through there. The theory is this, between this track and here, should be dead, and it is. We've got no power coming through from here. So if we switch the point the other way, and now we should have power from the frog to this rail, and it should be dead on that rail. So it's working as it should, and now that I've done that I can actually see how the wiring's going. For example, I use orange and yellow for the active wire, and black here is the common. And then for the actual points themselves, we've got the orange and the yellow, and then I use the brown for the common wire in here. So by setting up this wee test run here, I'm able to work out that if I switch it that way, so switching the switch to the yellow terminal, that is giving us a left track activation, and switching it to the right gives us the orange wire activation. So with that all kind of sorted out, it gives me the confidence to now actually wire this up completely as it should be, install this unit under the baseboard and start running through looms of wire from the control panel. Now I have gone ahead and added the additional switches to the control panel, which meant that I had to print out a little wee patch to stick onto the plan to give these extra sidings in here. So along with that, of course, I will add in dropper wires to each of the sections of track, and then once that's done, we'll give the whole area a test and make sure it's all working as it should. Right, so all the point work and the track work is now wired up, and of course it didn't go without just a wee bit of head scratching, and of course I wired up some of the points the wrong way around, some of the frog wire connections were around the wrong way, and the three-way point down here, it wasn't working at all until I discovered that I plugged that into the incorrect terminals and so on and so forth. So as I said before, when it comes to the wiring side of things, it does become quite complex for my grey matter, but I got there in the end and started doing some testing with just a couple of locomotives just to see how they ran on the new track, and of course with the frog polarity around the correct way and all the point motors working as they should. So I tested an 08 shunter and I tested a old Hornby 9F locomotive because it's probably one of the more dodgy locomotives I have. It's particularly fussy on track work and it needs a bit of a clean. I think the wheels need cleaning and so forth, so there is a bit of sticking here and there, but I thought being a long wheelbase 210 locomotive, it was probably the best choice to be able to test that through all the point work and also the changes in elevation and gradients. So it got through all the point work quite happily. So based on that, really all of my other locomotives should be able to traverse this new track work quite easily. So another plan that I have installed for this new track work is, because I'm using this DCC Concepts DCC DC solenoid decoder bank, of course it has some terminals on it for on and off LEDs, which naturally you might use actually on your control panel to indicate which way the points are actually activated. But of course the other beauty that I could use it for is some ground signals. So what my plan is, and I've placed an order with DCC Concepts, is to install some 2-aspect ground signals. Now I know that these aren't really standard for British Railways or UK Railways. Apparently 2-aspect signals were trialled as far back as the early 1920s, but I don't think they really became standard. I think standard these days is 3 and 4 aspect ground signals, but they'll work with this system because of course I can actually connect them into the LED terminals for each of the point control banks, and of course that will then change the signals to indicate which point is clear and which point is closed. So that should work quite well. It would also add quite an interesting scenic aspect to this whole sort of depot and yard area. Now, I can't say eat your heart out, Charlie Bishop, because my skills on the wiring front are pretty poor, and it is truly a spaghetti junction underneath the layout now. And just to do this section that I've just completed with all the track work, it looks like an absolute nightmare, and I certainly don't have the skill set that Charlie has when it comes to neat and orderly wiring. So there we have it for the end of stage 3. And of course, if there's one aspect that I've gained from my experiences in assembling this final piece, it is that I shouldn't become an electrician. So thankfully it's all working and everything is behaving as it should. And technically, in a way, the track work on this layout is finally complete. So from when this layout first began, possibly up to about 10 years ago, and that was over in the original part, but there's really nothing original about it any longer. It's taken that long to finalize all the track work, but there is a wee caveat there. There's never say never stop building track work, but I do think this is it. This is the final call, except for one stray siding sitting here. Now, although I said I was not going to put any track work in here because this is a lift out section, and I try to avoid that because you can get into a number of issues when you've got track work in lift out sections, particularly ones that you think you're going to be pulling in and out quite a bit. And I think this area will be an area where the scenery is going to be lifted out more frequently than other areas on the layout, because I do need to gain access to this area. But in saying that, I do have some thoughts. This is just a single track here, and the potential is I may run the siding a little bit further in, and that splits into 2 sidings. And this is where I have a water tower that could go in here, and also I do have an ash tower as well, so I'm thinking that could go in here, and it'll just give a little bit of extra siding space for any shunting locomotives that are bringing coal wagons into the coal stage. So I am going to consider that when it comes to actually setting up this area in here. And of course, going back to stage 2, I demonstrated the large hunks of styrene, the high density styrene that I'd cut out and shaped that slot into the space. So there is a potential, of course, to add some track onto that and theoretically line this up as best as possible. So who knows? I'm just sort of debating that at this stage and gonna sort of figure out whether it's feasible and workable. So I'll leave it there for today's episode. I certainly hope you've gathered some inspiration and ideas for your own layouts, and also, you know, the potential of using one of these DCC solenoid control boxes in, say, a certain area of your layout just to control maybe a depot or yard area. So do take care, everyone. Look after yourselves. Of course, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will catch you next time. Bye for now.